Corpse on Trial by Kerry Clark. A quick author's note. This is a work of historical fiction based on true people, real events, and one truly horrifying dispute. In the long and complex history of the Catholic Church, there are moments that defy belief. Some are miraculous. Others, like the Cadaver Synod, are harder to explain. In January of 897, Pope Stephen VI convened an extraordinary ecclesiastical trial. The defendant was his predecessor, Pope Formosus, dead and buried for 9 months. His body was exhumed, vested in papal robes, propped on a throne, and brought before a synod of bishops to face formal charges. A deacon was assigned to speak on his behalf. This was not legend, it wasn't even satire. It was a real moment in church history, deeply political, theologically fraught, and disturbing. The purpose was clear. By condemning Formosus posthumously, Stephen sought to invalidate his predecessor's decisions, particularly the appointment of rival bishops. But what began as a calculated power play quickly descended into something far more unsettling. It was a spectacle of desecration, a courtroom liturgy that blurred the line between justice and vengeance. It's easy, from a modern perspective, to treat such events as farce. But that would miss the deeper tragedy. Everyone in that basilica believed in something sacred. They believed in the church, in divine judgment, in order in the chaos. And yet here they were, watching their leaders tie a corpse to a chair and put it on trial. The story does not mock faith. Faith endures. What it does expose, unflinchingly, is what happens when power exploits that faith for its own ends, when ritual is twisted into spectacle, when memory becomes a battlefield, and even the dead are summoned to fight. You're about to read a dramatized account of real events. The characters may be imagined, but the horror was not. History did not flinch from putting a dead pope on trial. Neither will I. Let the synod begin. Corpse on trial. Real horror, not legend. Brother Dominic pressed a perfumed cloth against his nose as the basilica doors groaned open. 2 deacons entered backward, their faces twisted with strain, dragging something heavy between them. Behind them came 2 more, supporting what appeared to be. Dominic's stomach lurched. A corpse, dressed in full papal regalia. The body had been seated upright on a wooden throne, but the head lolled grotesquely to one side, the jaw hanging slack beneath sunken cheeks. The rich vestments, white silk trimmed with gold thread, draped awkwardly over the stiff limbs, failing to disguise the unnatural angles of death. Despite the heavy incense burning in censers throughout the room, the stench of decay thickened the air. Pope Stephen VI leaned forward on his throne, his thin lips curling into what might have been a smile. "Bring forth the accused," he said, voice echoing through the Basilica of St. John Lateran. "Let the synod begin." The deacons positioned the corpse directly before the current pope, then hastily tied it to the chair with rope, presumably to keep it from sliding off again. One of the corpse's hands dangled at an unnatural angle, and Dominic realized with horror that it had been reattached with string. Cardinal Boniface thrust a scroll into Dominic's trembling hands. "Read the charges," he hissed, clearly, for all to hear. Dominic stared at the parchment, the Latin words swimming before his eyes. 3 weeks ago, he had been a simple cleric in Ravenna. Now he stood in the holiest court in Christendom, serving as prosecutor against the mouldering remains of Pope Formosus. He scanned the gathered bishops, cardinals, and nobles filling the basilica. None would meet his eyes. Everyone seemed to accept this macabre theatre as normal, necessary, ordained. "Your Holiness," Dominic began, his voice cracking, "I present the charges against Pope Formosus." He wasn't supposed to be here. He was told this assignment would be quiet. 2 months earlier, Rome had appeared to Dominic as a vision from heaven itself. After years of study and prayer in the monasteries of Ravenna, His superiors had finally deemed him worthy of service at the heart of the church. He had arrived with his few possessions, a change of robes, his prayer book, and his mother's wooden crucifix, staring slack-jawed at the ancient monuments, the sprawling basilicas, the streets where actual saints and martyrs had walked. "Close your mouth, boy," his escort had grumbled. "You look like a peasant." Dominic had quickly composed himself, but the wonder remained. Here was the center of God's kingdom on earth, where Christ's representatives dispensed wisdom and justice. Here was order amidst the chaos of the collapsing world. Here was meaning. The reality proved somewhat different. On his third day, he witnessed 2 cardinals openly bidding for a vacant bishopric, the price rising with each exchange. On his 5th day, a servant whispered to him that the holy water in the papal chapel had been poisoned last month. Best to just wet your forehead and pretend. By his 10th day, he had learned that Rome had seen 3 popes in 2 years, each succession bloodier than the last. "But how can this be?" he had asked Brother Matteo, another junior cleric. "These men are Christ's representatives." Matteo had laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Christ's representatives who murder each other for a fancy hat." He'd shrugged. "The Saracens are at our gates. The empire is in fragments, and these princes of the church fight over scraps like dogs." Dominic had chosen silence after that. He kept his head down, performed his duties flawlessly, and prayed for guidance. At night, he wrote long letters to his former abbot, asking theological questions that disguised his growing despair. He never sent them. His diligence was noticed. Cardinal Boniface began requesting him specifically for certain tasks, transcribing letters, delivering private messages, assisting at minor ecclesiastical functions. Dominic took pride in these small recognitions. Perhaps he could still make a difference, still serve God among the corruption. That was why, when Boniface informed him, he would assist at an important synod, a great honor for one so junior, Dominic had felt a flutter of hope. Perhaps this was God's plan. Perhaps this was his chance to witness true church governance, to see justice and wisdom in action. "What manner of synod is it, Your Eminence?" he had asked. Boniface's eyes had gleamed strangely in the candlelight. "A most unusual one. Pope Stephen will try his predecessor for crimes against the church." "Pope Formosus? But he died last April." "Yes." Boniface had smiled thinly. "He did." The morning of the synod, Dominic had been summoned to a small chamber beneath the basilica. There, in the flickering torchlight, he found 3 deacons standing around a table. Upon it lay the disinterred body of Pope Formosus. 9 months dead, the corpse was in a state of advanced decay. The skin had turned a mottled greenish black where it hadn't shrunk back from the bones. The eye sockets were hollow, the lips withered to reveal yellowed teeth in a perpetual grimace. "We need to dress him," one deacon said, matter-of-factly, as if discussing preparations for Mass. Dominic stared, waiting for someone to laugh, to reveal the jest. When no one did, he choked out, This is blasphemy." "This is politics," the oldest deacon replied, shaking out the white papal vestments. "Now help us lift him." The body was surprisingly light, desiccated by time, yet still horrifically solid. As they struggled to maneuver the stiff limbs into the ceremonial garments, Dominic felt something give way beneath his hands. With a dry crack, the right hand broke off at the wrist. He dropped it with a yelp. "Careful," the oldest deacon snapped, snatching up the detached appendage. "These are the fingers that blessed emperors." "And appointed bishops Stephen once removed," muttered another. The oldest deacon scooped up the broken hand with a scowl. "Go get the vestments," he snapped at Dominic. When Dominic returned, the hand was back in place, hidden beneath wide silk sleeves, the wrist stiff but intact. Throughout the process, Dominic's mind screamed at him to flee, to denounce this abomination. Yet some colder, more pragmatic part of him, a part he hadn't known existed, whispered, "Stay silent. Survive." After all, who would listen? This desecration had been ordered by the Pope himself. When they finished, the deacons sprayed the corpse with perfume and rosewater, which did little to mask the underlying stench of putrefaction. One produced a scroll and handed it to Dominic. "You'll read the charges," he said. "Brother Octavius will speak for Formosus." A thin, nervous man stepped forward, nodding to Dominic. "I am to say only I am guilty, when prompted," he explained, his voice barely above a whisper. Nothing else. Dominic wanted to laugh or scream. Instead, he simply nodded. Before they carried the body upstairs, the oldest deacon paused, turning to Dominic with unexpected gravity. "Remember, boy, we serve the church, not the men who lead it. The church endures, even through this." But as Dominic followed the macabre procession up the narrow stairs, he wondered what kind of church could endure this and remain holy. Now, standing before the assembled witnesses with the charges in his shaking hands, Dominic struggled to keep his voice steady. Formosus, formerly Bishop of Porto, is charged with perjury, violating canon law by transferring from one see to another, and coveting the papal throne while Pope John VIII still lived. Pope Stephen VI leaned forward, his eyes fixed not on Dominic but on the corpse before him. His voice, when he spoke, trembled with barely contained rage. "How do you answer these charges, usurper?" Brother Octavius, standing beside the corpse, dropped his gaze to the floor. "I am guilty," he murmured. "Louder!" Stephen snarled. "So all may hear the confession." "I am guilty," Octavius repeated, his voice cracking. A murmur ran through the assembled crowd. From his position, Dominic could see the faces of Rome's elite, some horrified, others calculating, a few openly smirking. No one objected. No one walked out. The trial continued. A grotesque parody of justice. Stephen's questions grew more unhinged with each exchange. He stood from his throne, circling the corpse like a predator, spittle flying from his lips as he enumerated Formosus's supposed crimes. "You ordained priests illegitimately. You betrayed your oath. You conspired with the enemies of Rome." Each accusation was met with the same monotonous response from Octavius. "I am guilty." The smell in the room had become unbearable, even through Dominic's perfumed cloth. The heat of the crowded basilica and the hundreds of candles had accelerated the corpse's decomposition. A dark fluid began to seep through the white vestments. Midway through Stephen's diatribe, something happened that froze Dominic's blood. As the Pope jabbed an accusing finger toward the corpse's face, the body shifted slightly, the head rolling to one side. A collective gasp rose from the audience. "It moved," someone whispered. The dead Pope moved. Dominic knew it hadn't. Not really. Just gravity and decay working their inexorable processes. And yet, for a heartbeat, he had seen something like awareness in those empty eye sockets, something like judgment. Stephen faltered only momentarily before his rage redoubled. "Look at him," he shouted. "Even in death he defies the true church. Even in death he bears false witness." The trial descended further into madness. Stephen was no longer following the formal charges, but ranting about personal slights, obscure theological disputes, perceived insults from years ago. His face had flushed crimson, sweat pouring down his temples despite the January chill. Dominic's gaze darted between the living Pope and the dead one. Which, he wondered with sudden, terrifying clarity, was truly more alive? Stephen, consumed by hatred, seemed scarcely human in his fury. Formosus, though dead, retained a strange dignity in his silence. His actual innocence, or guilt, now irrelevant before God's final judgment. "The church isn't corrupt," Dominic realized with mounting horror. It's insane. History would record this day. January 897. When Pope Stephen VI convened the Cadaver Synod to retroactively invalidate the papacy of his predecessor. 9 months dead, Formosus was exhumed specifically to stand trial. The real reason was hardly theological. Stephen wanted to nullify all of Formosus's papal acts, especially the appointments of bishops and cardinals loyal to the former pope's faction. By declaring Formosus's papacy illegitimate, Stephen could replace these officials with his own supporters. But what had begun as political theatre had metamorphosed into something far darker, a theological abomination, a desecration that mocked the very foundations of Christian belief. The crowd that had gathered to witness this spectacle now filled every corner of the basilica. Nobles whispered behind cupped hands, priests stared in mute horror, and the common folk of Rome pressed against the back walls, crossing themselves repeatedly. Dominic felt oddly detached, as if watching the scene from above. He observed his own body standing rigidly beside the papal throne, noted the sweat staining his robes, saw the parchment trembling in his hands. But he felt nothing. When a fly landed on the corpse's cheek and crawled into its gaping mouth, Dominic didn't flinch. When Pope Stephen screamed that Formosus had never been pope, never been bishop, never been priest, he simply nodded along with the rest. The only moment that pierced his dissociation came when Cardinal Boniface nudged him sharply. "The formal denunciation," he whispered. "Read it." Dominic looked down at the final page of the scroll. The words swam before his eyes, a litany of curses, a complete repudiation of everything Formosus had ever done in God's name. To read it was to erase a man not just from life, but from history itself. He began to read, and to his shame, tears spilled down his cheeks. Not from pity for the dead pope, nor even from horror at the proceedings. He wept from shame. Shame that he was participating. Shame that his voice would be recorded by the scribes as part of this travesty. "By the authority of the Holy See," he read, his voice growing steadier with each word, "we declare null and void all ordinations, consecrations, and papal acts performed by the usurper Formosus." Through his tears, he thought he saw the corpse's jaw drop lower, as if in a silent scream. The verdict was never in doubt. Formosus was found guilty on all charges. What followed seemed to unfold in terrible slow motion. At Stephen's command, 3 attendants stepped forward. The first carried a knife, the second a pair of shears, the third a large wooden chest. "Strip him of his vestments," Stephen ordered. "He was never pope. He shall not wear the robes of office." The attendants fell upon the corpse like carrion birds, cutting away the rich garments rather than attempting to remove them properly. The fine silk parted with wet, tearing sounds, revealing the blackened, partially mummified flesh beneath. "The fingers of benediction," Stephen continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that nonetheless carried throughout the silent basilica. "Cut them off." Dominic watched, paralyzed, as the attendant with the knife stepped forward. With 3 quick, brutal strokes, he severed the 3 fingers of the right hand, the thumb, forefinger, and middle finger, with which popes bestowed blessings. The digits, already partially decomposed, came away with sickening ease, dropping into the wooden chest. A low moan rose from the crowd. Even in the factional chaos of Rome, this desecration crossed a boundary few had imagined possible. Stephen seemed to gather strength from their horror. He rose to his full height, pointing toward the Tiber River visible through the basilica's windows. "Cast the body into the river," he declared. "Let the waters carry away his corruption. Let no Christian grave harbor his bones." The attendants wrapped the now naked corpse in a coarse cloth and carried it from the basilica. The crowd parted before them, many crossing themselves or uttering prayers. Dominic stood rooted to the spot, the empty scroll dangling from his nerveless fingers. He had expected to feel something: revulsion, outrage, Perhaps even a twisted sense of justice if he truly believed the charges. Instead, there was only a vast emptiness. He had believed the church represented eternity, that its rituals and judgments transcended the pettiness of worldly concerns. Now he understood. Not even death was safe from politics. Not even the grave offered refuge from vengeance. As the basilica slowly emptied, Dominic remained, staring at the papal throne where Formosus had been propped only moments before. A dark stain marked the white marble, a viscous puddle of whatever fluids had seeped from the corpse. It gleamed in the candlelight, reflecting the golden crucifix hanging above, Christ watching his supposed representatives tear each other apart. He thought he should pray, should seek absolution for his part in this abomination. But no prayers came. What God would listen after this? Rumors rippled through Rome in the days that followed. Fishermen claimed Formosus's body had begun performing miracles in the Tiber, healing the sick, causing the blind to see. Others whispered that Stephen had been visited by Formosus's ghost, that the dead pope stood at the foot of his bed each night, dripping river water onto the floor. Within days, a monk secretly retrieved the body from the Tiber and gave it proper burial. Dominic heard these stories with detached interest. He performed his duties mechanically, spoke when spoken to, ate without tasting. At night, he no longer prayed, but stared at the ceiling of his small cell, replaying the synod in his mind. 6 months later, a violent earthquake shook Rome, causing part of the Lateran Basilica to collapse. Many saw it as divine judgment for the Cadaver Synod. A new pope, Romanus, swiftly replaced Stephen and annulled the proceedings against Formosus. 3 months after that, Pope Romanus was himself deposed, possibly poisoned. His successor, Theodore II, annulled the Cadaver Synod and had Formosus reburied with full honours in St. Peter's Basilica. 4 months later, Theodore was dead. Meanwhile, Pope Stephen VI, architect of the Cadaver Synod, had been imprisoned by a public uprising, stripped of his papal vestments just as he had stripped Formosus, and strangled in his cell. And Dominic? He was promoted. Cardinal Boniface commended his steadfastness during the synod, his ability to maintain composure in difficult circumstances. He was appointed to the papal chancery, where he drafted letters and edicts as popes rose and fell with alarming regularity. The church survived. The truth did not. Years later, Dominic would sometimes wake in the night, gasping for breath, convinced he could smell that same sweet putrid odour from the synod. The smell of flesh returning to dust, of judgment without justice, of power without principle. He never spoke of what he had witnessed. Who would believe it? Even as the story passed into history, its edges were softened, its horror sanitized. Some chronicles omitted it entirely, as if erasing the event could erase the sin. But Dominic remembered. He remembered every detail, the sound of the knife through desiccated flesh, the hollow echo of Octavius's, "I am guilty," the way Stephen's eyes bulged with hatred. Most of all, he remembered his own silence, his own complicity. On his deathbed, an old man far from Rome, he finally confessed the whole story to a young priest who listened with growing horror. When he finished, the priest made the sign of the cross with trembling fingers. "But the church survived this abomination?" the young man asked. "The church always survives," Dominic whispered. "It is built on bones and blood. It feeds on memory and forgetting." He closed his eyes, feeling death's approach not with fear but with a strange relief. Perhaps in the final judgment, God would show more mercy than his representatives on earth. As darkness closed around him, his nostrils filled one last time with that unforgettable smell. He could still smell the Pope's judgment, weeks later, sweet, wet, and crawling. Afterward, what the heck just happened? Yes, they really put a corpse on trial. The Cadaver Synod took place in January 897, under the orders of Pope Stephen VI. The body of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, dead for 9 months, was exhumed, dressed in papal robes, seated on a throne, and tried in the Basilica of St. John Lateran. The charges? Violating canon law by transferring sees, perjuring himself, and coveting the papacy. The punishment? Stripped of office, his fingers of blessing cut off, and his corpse hurled into the Tiber. This is not satire. This is history. Now, let's separate the sake and the scandal. What's real? Pope Formosus did die in April 896. Pope Stephen VI really did exhume his body for a posthumous trial. The corpse was dressed in pontifical robes, placed on a throne, and assigned a deacon to speak on its behalf. He was found guilty, and his acts as pope were retroactively nullified, including ordinations. His body was mutilated, then dumped in the Tiber, later retrieved and buried. Pope Stephen was later imprisoned and strangled to death in his cell, likely due to backlash from the synod. The next few popes rapidly reversed and re-reversed the verdict, depending on which faction they favored. The church was less a rock than a decay and religious trauma. Though for real Dominic was present, I'd like to buy him a stiff drink. Dialogues are imagined, based on the historical tone and politics of the period. Sensory details were filled in, like the stench, the perfumed cloths, the collapsing sanity of Pope Stephen, to evoke the psychological horror that no chronicler dared put into words. The line, "I am guilty," was the deacon's only assigned phrase in our telling. History doesn't record his exact words, just that someone was appointed to speak for the corpse, which may be worse. The Catholic Church of 897 was not today's church. This was a time of brutal political factionalism, with popes installed by noble families, often at sword point. Piety and power wrestled constantly, sometimes literally. While the actions of Pope Stephen were grotesque, they are not reflective of Catholic theology, doctrine, or most clerics of the time. The faithful deserved better. Wait, which Stephen was that again? If Pope Stephen VI is getting your goat, or you just tried searching for him and ended up confused, you're not alone. Depending on which source you check, he may also be listed as Stephen VII. There was an earlier Pope-elect Stephen who died before his consecration in 752. Some church lists counted him, others didn't. The result was a glorious mess of papal numerology. The Stephen of the Cadaver Synod is usually called Stephen VI, but some older or alternate records may list him as Stephen VII. So, if you're reading this and muttering, "I swear Pope Stephen VII did this," you're not wrong. You're just living in a footnote fight between medieval scribes and modern scholars. Whatever the number, he'll always be the pope who put a corpse on trial. Some legacies don't need a numeral. And still, despite everything, the church endured. This event leaves us with a chilling question. If your enemy can put you on trial after death, what makes you think they won't win? Historical side effects disclaimer. Cadaver Synod edition. This story is for entertainment purposes only. Do not exhume past traumas or popes without proper spiritual supervision. Side effects of participation may include, but are not limited to, acute corpse anxiety, recurring ecclesiastical nightmares, irreversible loss of faith in church politics, phantom smells of holy decay, and a sudden distrust of chairs. If you find yourself yelling, "I am guilty," on behalf of a mouldering corpse, stop reading and consult a licensed confessor immediately. Not recommended for viewers who believe in the sanctity of the dead, basic courtroom procedure, or the idea that the Pope should not scream at decomposing bodies in public. May cause hallucinations involving river-haunting pontiffs, theological whiplash, or side effects best described as deeply medieval. Use of this material may lead to promotion within the Vatican bureaucracy against your will. This story has not been approved by any living pope, or dead ones. For best results, store corpses in a cool, dry place, preferably not on trial. Like what you heard? Hit like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell for more real stories of rot, blood, and absolutely unholy behavior. This is Heinous History, your channel for stories you won't believe, but actually happened.